Thanks all of you for being here. Last year I was in this bar and the panel was the global world order. So it's a place where people come with confusing topics where they feel they need a drink. So we're going to talk about the 2016 campaign, what went wrong, what can be improved upon in 2020. I just want to put us in historical context. My understanding is that there's some people who are unhappy with the 2016 campaign and the way it ran. So I'd like to offer you just a little bit of historical perspective. Here's one quote. "In regard to the method pursued by political parties with reference to electing their respective candidates, there seems to be just one opinion, that it is disgraceful to the country." That's the New York Mirror in 1852. "The organized bigotry, the like of which I have never seen, I feel as if some poison gas had spread over us and that our democracy will suffer from this for many years to come." That is about the 1928 election. And this last one, "Anyone who feels good about American politics after the 1988 presidential campaign probably also enjoys train wrecks or maybe a day at the beach watching an oil slick wash ashore." So, Susan Page, we are in the tradition of American politics that people are unhappy with the way the campaigns are run, take place, the way voters behave, journalists, pollsters. So let's do a little diagnosis first. What was the problem in 2016? Was there one?
So in 60 seconds or less,
Sure.
in the debate tradition for Wednesday and Thursday night,
Right.
I have 60 seconds to diagnose what was wrong in 2016. Yeah. So actually, I've covered. Historically, it's true. We've had ups and downs with elections in the past. People are almost always unhappy with our politics. But this was the 10th presidential election I've covered, and it was by far the most disruptive, the one that caused the most angst by everyone, the one that was most confused. And I think I may have stolen this line from you, but the thing we learned most about 2016 was, the lesson we learned most was humility. Because I feel like we didn't do a good enough job in explaining and understanding and explaining what was going on. I think it's a time in our country when there's a lot of dissatisfaction, and President Trump didn't invent that dissatisfaction, but he really opened the door to take advantage of it in a way that was remarkable to see, and it took us a while to understand.
Margie, you're a pollster, and you've dealt with Democratic campaigns, right? The DCCC, the DNC. So the pollsters get some grief, and the journalists who are addicted to polls get some grief in 2016. So what do you think happened with the polls in 2016? And the options are, actually the polls were right about the popular vote, or the polls were totally wrong, or somewhere in the middle.
So it's amazing that I still get this question. This is a question that people are desperate to find an answer to, and it's not just because people, someone said, "Hey, I still remember a public poll out of Michigan that was off a couple points." It's because the whole world was led to believe that an outcome that people thought was inconceivable was actually not going to happen, and then it happened. And so I think the just enormity of what happened, I think, is why people still find this topic interesting. And so there's been a lot of introspection in the industry since 2016. The public polls, I think, were off in part because of education. There's been a lot of analysis from the industry, and when you weight some of the public polling by education a little bit differently, it actually reduced a lot of the error. And then that error was magnified by the forecasters, and then that error was magnified by people who wrote transition stories and other kinds of decisions. So there was a little bit of error in weighting, and I don't mean error that somebody made a mistake because they did something wrong, but because education and the educational composition of the electorate's unknowable, and it was a big driver in voters' views toward Trump. It still is. So you see a lot of people trying to adjust. We have adjusted how we ask educational attainment. We do more qualitative. We do more focus groups. I think we've adjusted as an industry.
So just very quickly, for those who might not know, explain this is like explain thermodynamics in 10 seconds, but explain what you mean by weighting.
Yes.
Because pollsters make essentially a guess about the composition of the electorate And that is different than interviewing everybody in the whole country and tallying up what they decide.
Right. So, there's somebody who was head of one of the polling industry associations said, we have this tool that is used to measure pounds, but we want it to measure ounces. Like, we want this precision on the polling, and that brings us back to the debate polling, which I'm sure we'll get to, where we want to have a precision that actually doesn't exist yet in the electorate this far out. Maybe it's something we can feel that we're getting closer to as we're a couple weeks out, but at this stage, it's definitely not something that exists. And so what there's error. Sometimes a poll will come in maybe a little bit more Democratic than you think, or a little bit more Republican, or a little bit more male or female, things where you have some census data to give you a sense of what the electorate looks like, and so you adjust it. So you multiply one person by 1 point something to kind of weight them up a little bit, or by 0 point something to weight them down a little bit. And this is something that every single polling outlet does in some way, shape, or fashion, and it can make a real difference. In fact, it made a difference in who qualified for the debates, where you had the difference in weighting of one respondent actually made a difference in who was potentially on who was on the debate stage.
Robert Costa, we know why campaigns need polls. Why do we need to talk about polls? And should we stop?
Polling matters to a point. It helps inform the reporting, but the reporting has to remain at the core. The reporters have to get out in the country and talk to voters, and that has never become more apparent than over the last few years, where if you sit in a newsroom and you rely on polling data, then you are getting just a sliver of the picture. And I really trace this back 11 years ago to when I entered the journalism field. It was in the hot summer of 2008, the fall of 2008. I came into this business during that economic recession, the end of the 2008 campaign, and my first assignment was to cover Sarah Palin's vice presidential campaign. It was actually the best thing that ever happened, because it forced me initially as a reporter to get right up to voters to talk about, at that point, their loss of faith in institutions, in parties, in the economy, and even their own family, their community. And I had just read books like Bowling Alone, by Robert Putnam in college. And so I was just going around in 08, 09. I covered Sarah Palin's book tour. It seemed like the worst assignment you could get as a young reporter. But I just kept confronting voters who were losing faith in the country on both sides. And this is why talking to voters matters. In 2014, the two key decisions we made at the Post is I had breakfast with Donald Trump and I had breakfast with Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders gave one of his first interviews to the Post talking about his campaign. We tried to recognize that if you went beyond the polls, there was an opportunity to capture the rising populism and nationalism and racism that was out there on the right and on the left. When you talk to Senator Sanders, when he would talk about the corporate media and progressive values. And so what I write on the top of every notebook is assume nothing. Because if you just go by polls and you go by the norms of American politics, then you're going to miss the story. Because everywhere you go as a reporter, you encounter the fracturing of this country. And you have to accept it, not judge it, not assume it's going to follow by any norm, and just report it out. And still use polls to try to guide you, but they're not the story.
The same experience with the Buchanan campaign in 1992. Same deal. You and a lot of the same voters were supporters of Sarah Palin later. One thing we hear from viewers, readers, is always, but what about the issues? Why are you talking about polling, the horse race, sure, something might be happening out in the country, but what about the important issues? Are they undercovered, and what does that mean, cover the issues?
I think as someone who covered both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, there can be issues and there can be policies. So President Trump, I think, arguably, even if you ask him, he was running a campaign that wasn't focused on this is the policy that I'm going to give you, but more this is the emotion that you're feeling, and I'm going to make sure that you feel good about America, that I hear the fact that you are so frustrated that even if you have a job, it's not a good job, and that the trade deals have taken all these jobs out of your country. And there's also this idea that these immigrants immigrants, they're somehow the reason why your life is as hard as it is. On the Bernie Sanders side, you would have someone also say, I understand that the system's rigged. I understand that your life is harder. And those people to blame are not the immigrants, they're the billionaires. So I think you had two men who were in some ways understanding that people were frustrated with their lives. And I would add to that, as a reporter who didn't cover President Obama's campaign, but who read a lot of stories as a college student. And we had all these stories about hope and change and how amazing it was that we elected an African-American president. I don't think we had that many stories about people who were furious at the fact that this person was who was representing the country. So I think if you add both the issues and the frustrations economically, and then you add the idea that people are literally seeing their towns change. I've interviewed so many people who say, well, my grandkids are going to school with these immigrants. The people who are driving me to the hospital now is this man, he has a weird accent. I don't really feel comfortable with him. I think those are the issues that I think we need to cover more. There's a great series going on right now in the New York Times where a reporter named Asted Wesley, he's covering white identity politics. And I think we don't talk about that enough in this country. The idea that when I would go out to talk to Trump supporters, I can think of one story. I was asking him about healthcare policies. I was like, why are you excited about the president's healthcare policies? And for like 10, 15 minutes, I'm asking. And he kept saying, well, people think I'm a racist. And I was like, well, why do people think you're a racist finally? And I had to, first of all, forget that I was an African-American woman asking him about healthcare, because in his mind, he was like, this black woman wants to know about race. So when I asked him that, he said, well, I just think that there are too many black people in my town. And his town was about 97% white. But what he was telling me was that he was starting to see a little bit of the people from Milwaukee start to move north. And essentially that was what was driving him. So even though as a reporter you want to talk about healthcare policy or other things, I think it's critical to let people that you're interviewing give you the story. Because a lot of times you go out with an assignment, and I think Robert and all of us, you go out with an assignment, but sometimes the assignment, I think if you listen closely enough, people will tell you what they're really thinking. And I think that's probably something that we're not doing enough of, is we go out to talk about Medicare for all or whatever, and maybe the issue is really healthcare prices and the fact that someone went to the hospital and $25,000 later they can't pay their bill. So I think as reporters this time around, I'm hoping that when we go out to do whatever story we're doing about reparations or whatever, that we sit back and let people tell us what they're actually feeling and not just stick to the issues that we think are important.
Right. Lauren, you help train people to engage in civic dialogue. How do you do that? What do you prepare them for? Is it a hellscape out there, or do you say no, there are people who can be appealed to by reason? And
yeah, and I just want to add something which is a little outside of your question, because I'm the only I'm one of two non-journalists on the panel, but I've been doing a lot of writing lately about the need for a deeper, more meaningful focus on the 6 women that are running for president, but also just more balanced coverage generally, because back to your original question, I don't think you can talk about 16 without talking about a number of factors in the media landscape that are totally gendered. One is that the Me Too movement started in July of 2016 when Gretchen Carlson sued Roger Ailes, who was at the time the chief communications advisor to President Trump. That was the beginning of Me Too. And when you think about who the journalists were, many of whom were the most visible on television, in some of the debates and in some of the interviews, a number of those men then got caught up in Me Too and have lost their jobs since. And there are a number of women now who are ascendant in their journalism careers now for 2020, whose careers in many ways have been enabled because some of the guys that didn't belong there got booted. And I think that is different. We still have less than 30% of newsrooms are female. Less than 30% of the on-air talent across most of media is female. If you want to get into these numbers, enjoy some time on the Women's Media Center website, where I spend a lot of time. But we've got to call this stuff out. There was a lot of gender issues that overlaid a huge amount of what happened in 16, including a total underestimation of the views of conservative women, and I'm going to get to your question because it's connected, the views of conservative women across America who never saw the sort of democratic feminism as their story. And that goes straight back to Phyllis Schlafly and the end of ERA. Mm-hmm. There's a real line between conservative women in America who were very uncomfortable with Hillary Clinton and a narrative over many years which has said, you know, politics and feminism is exclusively the domain of women on the left. So we are one of the only nonpartisan women's political education organizations in America. And we are, even in this wildly polarized time, because we're trying to get to women who have been on the margins of the political process, who either see it as so hopelessly broken that they don't show up, they don't participate, or who will pay attention to absolutely everything else but politics, even when politics runs right through their lives, right? And in some instances, we train a lot of survivors of domestic violence, for instance. You know, that's 1 in 3 American women. Well, we can't reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. There's multiple pieces of legislation that our presidential candidates and congressional candidates and everyone in Congress affects that women think have nothing to do with their lives. So all of this is part of the same picture, which is that women are the majority of the electorate. They outvote men. They've outvoted men in every election since 1980. And yet in every major cycle, we seem to forget that until something big happens that makes us pay attention to it.
Just quickly, let me follow up on that, though. So when you talk about the disconnect between voters and their self-interest in this case, so in this case we're talking about women voters, one of the challenges for people covering campaigns is covering what people are actually interested in and what they should be, or what people think they should be. You often have candidates talking to the economic self-interest of voters, and then voters will vote against their economic self-interest, whether it's working class voters who vote for candidates who don't particularly care about them, or very wealthy people who vote to have their taxes raised. How easy do you see is it to make the argument on substantive grounds that changes people's kind of initial feelings, which often can be kind of gut-level emotional reactions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Amish. I think that the emotional piece of this is just we wildly underestimate how big of a factor that is. I mean, look, I think most Americans, a couple things. Look, we have a civics crisis in America. Americans do not understand how our political process works, okay? 70% of Americans cannot name a single person that represents them in elected office. 70%, okay? So we then go out and try and have these conversations with voters that are about sort of primarily most of the polls, and we were just talking about this, it sort of asks people, rank the issues that matter to you most. Is it abortion? Is it healthcare? Is it the economy? But I just think that, like, from the time that I spend with so many people in the heartland of America, you know, mostly women, but when we talk to them about their politics, like, they just don't think about it in those linear terms. Like, it is this kind of emotional piece. There is they want that personal connection. There's something else that people are making their decisions on, which I'm not sure we've really unpacked as much as we should. And I think we really have to for this cycle.
Robert, is the voter the one who should be driving the bus always in campaign coverage? So, you know, obviously when the Republic was created, the idea of a direct democracy was as frightening as the idea of a monarch. So the idea that journalists go to talk to voters, listen to what they have to say and what they care about is obviously an important part of the picture. But what if the voters don't understand the major issues that can only be decided through collective action in American government? What is the responsibility of the press to say, here are the 5 issues that are the most important ones and that can only be solved by a president working with a Congress? Is that obligation 10% of the job, 5% of the job, 50% of the job?
You have to cover the full scope of American politics. If you're going to be a political news organization or a television show, you have to cover the candidates, and you have to cover the voters, and you have to cover the issues. Within that, you try to explain, and we do this on PBS, we do this at the Washington Post, fact checks and explainers, whether it's in the written form or the televised form, to try to inform the audience about, in a nonpartisan way, about why issues unfold in certain ways on the policy grounds, what the history is of those issues. But I'm not really sure of your question, John. Are you saying to just ignore the voter if they don't understand the issue?
No. I'm saying in the great feast of elections, right, what size is basically the vegetable portion, which is here's our 5-part series on issue X, which is really important because the stakes are really high, whether it's China, whether it's cyber warfare, whether it's climate, whether it's income inequality, something you might not get at a rope line. You might not get when you talk to voters. You might not hear the candidates talking about it. The idea of shared sacrifice doesn't get talked about a lot. And if is it a news organization's obligation to say, we objectively know these are important things that have to be addressed?
I would disagree with your characterization of them as vegetables in this way. If they're presented poorly, they will be vegetables to the voter and to the reader.
Well, then dessert, whatever. What portion does it
my
make
point
on the
is,
plate?
it's the responsibility of news organizations to make sure that the product we're creating is compelling to people and informative. Too often, I see different news organizations struggle to make that content compelling. They say, well, we'll have a policy page and a fact check. This is a vigorous political system in this country, and the debate among the candidates is amazing right now. 25 Democrats, President Trump with his point of view. This debate on all these issues, we have foreign policy in this country has been totally upended. You have a president who's taken the Democratic position on trade, who's adopted nationalism as the core of his foreign policy. You have some Democrats now more hawkish on Russia and other issues, on NATO, than the Republican president. We should welcome this debate and not just sit back and say, oh, it's conflict. It's not conflict if it's covered in a serious way through reporting. And this is, I think, sometimes the gap in our industry, is we think, oh, we need to have explainers, and then there's just the game of politics. It's not that cut and dry. Yet we have to find a way to cover this amazing foreign policy debate. Paul Ryan was here yesterday. The Republican Party walking away from entitlement reform, having all the power in Washington and just saying no thanks. It's an amazing story. Let's present the story and stop saying, oh, well, we're just being good citizens by making this boring content to provide to the viewer. Then we're not doing our job.
So there's a bit of a polling answer to this question, because outlets the public polling will reflect what outlets think will make news, what they want to write about, what they think influences the dialogue. And you'll hear a lot of folks on Twitter, which is obviously real life, say issue polling is bad. All issue polling is bad, because they're looking at public issue polling that has one question. Are you for stronger gun laws? Or are you pro-choice or pro-life? Are you in favor of the Green New Deal? And because it's not to fault any of the outlets. They have a million other things that they need to do in their polls, and that's what presumably somebody in the newsroom is saying, this is what we want to include in a story. But organizations who do internal polling, which folks may dismiss sometimes publicly because there's a D or R affiliation, really want to figure out how to talk about these issues. We'll do very long surveys and really big focus group projects to really figure out, should we talk about it this way? What if we talked about it this way? Where did you get your information about this? But a lot of that stuff doesn't make it into the public dialogue, and instead the outlets will have polling questions on, there was one outlet in 2018 that said, ask people, who do you think is going to win the House? Who do you think is going to win the Senate? And the numbers were the same, because voters don't know about the map, what the Senate map looks like versus what the House map looks like. Or we'll say, well, who should Democrats focus on more, independents or on their base? I mean, a lot of these polling questions will ask people to be political consultants rather than try to understand the depth of the issue. But it's out there. It's just less likely to be part of what the outlets do themselves and then cover.
Let me ask you about social media. Was one of the successes of 2016 that reporters were on Twitter all the time?
What do you mean, like, success of 2016?
Sorry, I was being
emotionally
I was
traumatic,
being
maybe.
facetious. Yeah, yeah. Let me ask a version of the polling question: should reporters get off Twitter?
Of course not. I think the president of the United States is literally making public policy issues, foreign policy issues on Twitter. I bought this Apple Watch because I was sleeping through news cycles, because I wasn't waking up at 5:30 in the morning when the president was tweeting about whatever he was tweeting about, and waking up at 6:30 and having literally missed an entire news cycle. It's not healthy. I'll give you that. But I think what you need to have is your ear to the ground.
And we should interject. Your job is to be all over everything he does. I mean, in other words, if you were covering the entire political race, you might not do that. But
yeah, I think either way, being on Twitter is critically important. I would say even there used to be this thing called ombudsmen at newspapers. They were basically public editors where they would actually look internally at the paper. Someone would be at the Washington Post or the New York Times, and their job was to critique essentially the work of the New York Times or other places. Antiquated, I know. What is happening now is that Twitter is in some ways serving that purpose. I think of Black Twitter and I think of Ferguson. We would not have been able to cover Ferguson in the way we did had we not been on Twitter, listening to people's stories from the ground. So I think it's critically important to be on Twitter because I think as a reporter, it keeps you humble. No, I don't like when there are hundreds of thousands of people yelling at me, saying all sorts of terrible things to me. But there's always that couple tweets that when I look at them that say, you know what, maybe I should have worded that differently, or maybe we should look into that differently. I think that we owe it as reporters for us to listen to people and to hear what they're saying. And I'll add one other thing. There's this idea of, you were talking about women and 1 in 3 of them being sexually assaulted. And I think what's important also when we look at kind of the way that people are living their lives, I remember after the Access Hollywood tape, I ran down to North Carolina. I had a watch party with Republican women asking them about the Access Hollywood tape. And they said, well, Donald Trump sounds like my husband and my dad, so I don't really care. And I thought to myself, isn't that a story? If we had the time, isn't it a story to actually figure out why women are not bothered by the fact that someone would say that to you? I think that's some of the things that you might get on Twitter, you might not. But I think to take it back, listening to what people are actually telling you, they're not telling you, oh, I'm not bothered by this Hollywood Access tape. They're telling me, well, I've had to live with that and I've had to figure out how to deal with that. So why would I hold this person to a higher standard than I'm holding my own husband?
Yeah. No, I think we all have
real.
versions of that story. Do you want to?
No, look, I mean, I think it's real, and I think, look, I am someone who believes that the gender dimension of our elections is vastly underreported writ large. Okay, like blanket statement, underreported, underappreciated. I mean, people like Howard Dean, I mean, God bless Howard Dean, I had to tell him some of the basic facts about, how women's representation in the country. We're not paying attention. And I think like the Roy Moore, Doug Jones race is a perfect illustration of that. Black women are the most civically engaged Americans. They are more likely to be, it's just truth. They are more likely to be registered to vote and more likely to turn out at the polls than any other Americans, and they have been for the last 20 years. But we never covered that. We never heard about it. Americans didn't know that until the Roy Moore, Doug Jones race, because black women turned that race. And that was a nationally watched race. So across the board, like this is an election where we have 6 women that have qualified for the debates, okay? I wrote a piece yesterday about this. There are 4 men that did not, yet all 6 women, including Marianne Williamson, who's never run for office and has no political experience, qualified for the debates. And Marianne Williamson qualified on both polling and contributions when a number of the men could only get one of those categories. We don't hear about this, and I'm just going to say I think this is one of these things that everyone needs to be watching this ball in this next election cycle. It is, to your point, like these are the stories that we're missing, and they are 100% a huge factor in how these elections get decided.
Susan, let me ask you about fact-checking. We are in the high age of fact-checking. It happens all the time. There's a lot more than 10 races ago that you were covering. It certainly was more than when I started. Are fact checks a universal good, or have some candidates learned that if you say something that's untrue, it'll get covered as in a fact check, and the underlying untruth ends up being spread by the fact check?
So I think fact checks are an important thing to do, and we should keep doing them. I think they are a force for good. But what's changed about fact checking in the 2016 election and now is that when it used to be when you did a fact check and you found a politician said something that was wrong or run an ad that had an inaccuracy in it, they would stop saying it. And that is no longer the case. And what happens now is that the Trump core voters, 35 or 40% of the electorate, either don't believe the fact checker or don't care if the president is saying something that's inaccurate. And both those things are distressing. So I don't think we deal with this by not doing fact checks. I think one way we now try to deal with this is by making fact checks an integral part of your daily news coverage. Mm-hmm. So that, for instance, there was a time when there was the canard that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. And you might say, Donald Trump says Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. And it'd be in the second paragraph that you'd say, Barack Obama says he was born in the United States. We stopped doing that, making it sound like they had equivalent statements, right? And we started making the case that Barack Obama was born in the United States because we know that from looking at facts. And in fact, we then started to put in the headline and in the lead of the story that the statement was inaccurate, that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. And that is something we have learned to do to avoid repeating the inaccuracy. Now, sometimes it's hard on a complicated issue to put the correction in the headline, but it is important, I think, because some people will only read the headline, so you need to say debunk theory or inaccurately or untruth.
Right.
And that is something we have learned in the past 4 years.
So, Robert Costa, people would say, why don't you just say he lied?
We do.
But how often?
Very often.
Daily? How
Depends
many
on the story.
How many times does a politician lie that it gets framed as such? The reason I ask that is there's a study that was done recently about fake news, things that are actually fake news, not the thing you don't like and then call it fake news, which is a distinction, but something that's actually made up. And the political scientists studied it and found that labeling something as fake news creates a response in readers where they see if something is not labeled as fake news, that it's then automatically true. So that in trying to be more rigorous about spotting false stories, they've created a situation in which people, when they don't see something called out as false, they'll believe is true. And as we know, something that's not entirely false does not necessarily make it true. So back to the question of lying, does it have to be called that every time, or is it just on the whoppers?
No. You call out a lie when it's a lie, and you explain why in a clear and straightforward way. At the Washington Post and on Washington Week, we're not afraid to use the word lie, but you don't use the word lie in a political way. I'll tell you a quick story. In 2016, during the transition, when President Trump was elected, Steve Bannon told a few reporters that their main enemy was the press. And we asked why. Why is that? And he said, because the Democrats don't have power. The Democrats can't subpoena us. The Democrats are older, and they're just not an effective party in his view. He said, we think every day about the press. And he said, every time we say, speaking as the Trump administration, we say fake news, they are saying that not just to define the media in their eyes, they are actually trying as a strategy, and he's articulated this, to provoke the response, the defensive response. We are not fake news. Why do they do that? Bannon and others have said they do this because they want the media to be talking about the media. So the country only sees the media in a defensive crouch, responding to the call of fake news and talking in an explaining defensive way about why that's not true. The media, in my personal view, must often resist the bait, hold firm when you have a lie from any party, whether it's President Trump or someone else. You call it out immediately, you calmly explain why it's a lie in a clear and straightforward way, and then you stop and you keep reporting. We are living in the most charged time, at least I've ever seen in my lifetime, and all these political people want to do that I cover day in and day out, believe me, they want to politicize the press. And so the press has to be so careful to not get pulled into this riptide where we become painted as political actors. To be able to defend ourselves on the fake news charges, which are absurd, you have to make sure you stay unemotional so you could actually present facts and people can say the press, we rely on them. They're not just people fighting about their reputation. They're people informing and illuminating our national discourse.
Could I just,
Go ahead, Yumesh.
I'll say one thing. I think that what Robert said is so critical. I also think that as a reporter, and I would say as someone who's watching this news, you also have to allow yourself to feel things and then move on. Because I think of the time that President Trump, I'm of Haitian descent, both my parents were born in Haiti. He called Haiti an asshole country. Another time he said Haitians brought AIDS to this country. And I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to cover this story do what I do, say it's, it's obviously a lie, and then move on. And then I got a call from my aunt who was literally crying. And she was crying because she immigrated to the United States in the 70s and remembers people saying she had AIDS, and remembers people saying that. And I think that as reporters, we both have to be unemotional and say, obviously that's fake. Obviously we can defend ourselves without being angry, but also understand that the reason why there's such raw times is because people are watching this and are emotionally touched by all the things that are going on. The children that are being separated from their families, all these different things. As a reporter, I think you have to somehow convey that you understand that people are feeling that way without getting, as you said, as Robert said, caught up in the argument. So as a reporter at the White House, I pose questions to the president all the time. I never get angry or I'm never screaming at him. That's not my style. But I also have to understand that I have to check myself when I walk into the White House because I need to make sure that I'm not carrying anything that I heard or anything that I saw into the White House because it is the job. The job is to go in there and not be emotional. And I think sometimes people might think that that comes off as cold, but it's because we're really there trying to be focused on representing the people who will never make it to the White House, who will never visit or see or be able to pose a question to the president.
Margie, let me ask you about, we've got debates coming up. How does the press cover so many candidates in these multiple night events with wisdom?
You guys are going to do a great job. So there are a couple things that make the debates complicated. The first is who qualifies for the debates, which is something I've followed pretty closely. The debate polling, the threshold, which is not a press, that's the DNC's rule, that's not a press rule, that's not NBC's rule, looks at a horse race number, looks at a head-to-head number of, an entire list of candidates. It excludes an open-ended question, which is the kind the Washington Post has. It excludes other kinds of things that you might look at to examine which candidates are stronger than others, like favorability or hard ID. It doesn't compare, some of them have smaller sample sizes because they're a primary sample within a larger national survey. So it's fraught, but it has spurred an enormous amount of polling coverage just on these questions. I mean, the number of stories about the polls themselves to qualify the debate is astounding. I think so.
Sorry, just to interrupt, because the polls are supposed to be some kind of reflection of status within the Democratic
Party.
Right,
but we're making differences between less than 1%, 1%, 2% in, a poll that has 400 approximately Democratic primary voters in it. And, it's a way to figure it out, but it's also a window that started in January, not before. I mean, there was a variety of different rules, and I understand that there are cutoffs for all of them, but it makes it a challenge for, it is an imperfect way of assessing candidate strength. This is not your question, but just to carry on the debate piece, but at the same time, you have the donor threshold, which is, then led candidates to spend a lot of time trying to cultivate dollar donations, online, as opposed to, some of the other ways that people might try to generate support. Now, what it means for the press and how they cover different candidates, I mean, you see candidates rise and fall nationally by pretty small margins, but still rising and falling. How much of that comes from press coverage? I mean, are people meeting Pete Buttigieg in their neighborhood, or are they reading a lot of news coverage and watching a lot of clips of him? Now, that's not to take away from his talents, but where should the press, if the press put that amount of attention on another candidate, what would happen to that other candidate? We don't know. There's a huge field, and I know that's complicated with all the resources involved, but you have that combination of a very strict set of polling rules, a large field, a few candidates getting a lot of coverage, and it makes it really difficult for voters to really figure out, to have a real assessment. 2/3 of voters saying they're not really paying a lot of attention, of primary voters aren't paying attention.
Lauren, I think you want to jump on that, but let me ask you this question, or add to it, or just ignore it altogether and say what you were going to say. It happens to me all the time.
It's what you learn in TV how to do.
No, I learned that at home. Let's say you have a candidate who has a hot hand, has a moment on a rope line, it gets all this coverage. Suddenly we're all talking about the moment on the rope line, showed authenticity, and then there's another candidate who's doing the diligent work of addressing the issues that are facing the country, who has a set of attributes that are suited to the job, but people just aren't that excited about. what does the press do with those two instances?
Well, I'm glad I'm not a journalist in this election cycle because I think it's a really tough question. I mean, look, the challenge that we have right now, and this is a little bit back to your original point about vegetables, right? You know, we have a very poorly informed electorate generally. And, you know, I do a lot of TV, and, you know, the conversations, part of, you talked about, like, what the sort of drive for news to be entertaining and draw people as well as be informative. And, you know, I definitely feel that it is, and I think a lot of people in this room would probably agree, swung towards the entertaining in a big way and away from the informing. And those stories, those hot moments, I can't tell you how many times I get called and, you know, get asked to spend 15 minutes on a show talking about one of these relatively irrelevant things when there's like massive issues happening around the world that we're not covering. I mean, we've cut back on the coverage of foreign affairs, right? We have very few journalists that are working overseas that ever get airtime to talk about international issues. You know, exceptions being in places like PBS and others. But in most of the news, it is those salacious kind of hot moments that are ratings draws that wind up being every single show, you know, for the first like 7 hours of a Saturday morning, as opposed to, you know, going deep on issues. And so I really think it's hard for the electorate, and most of them are not on Twitter. They're getting very limited news. And so when you go out and you ask people, well, what do you know about these candidates? You know, all they have to go on in some cases is these very, you know, superficial moments. And that is where I really hope for all of us that we can swing back the other way. There is too much at stake in this election for it to all just be about, you know, gaffes and hot moments on the line. Like, we've got to push ourselves harder to recognize the power that we have to help people understand more deeply.
But, you know, John, if a candidate has talking about solutions and has all the attributes that he or she would need to be president, they're able to make a connection with voters. And so if a candidate is making a lot of intellectual arguments and not connecting with voters, they do not have the job skills they need to be elected president and serve as president. And we see candidates like Elizabeth Warren would be an example, who is talking with her calling card is how specific she is on a whole range of issues, how many plans she has. She has a plan for that. I'm sure we're going to hear that on Wednesday night. And that's the task.
But people understand
her. The obsession with the hot moment on a rope line, it's true that's true, but that's especially true for cable TV, and it is less true for all the other ways, all the other kinds of media, including print outlets and non-cable TV. I mean, that is the special sauce that gets the audience that is most interested in watching cable TV. That's not everybody, and that's not all media.
Yes, and so thinking back to 2016, a lot of people would say that cable and broadcast television and print to a lesser degree just couldn't pull away from Donald Trump, and so feed that into your previous response.
Well, and it's certainly true, although I think cable TV was the biggest offender by taking Donald Trump rallies because they were, you know, kind of mesmerizing. That was certainly true, and more so than Hillary Clinton rallies. So yes, I think it's a lesson that we struggled to learn, to not be distracted by every provocative tweet. Because one of the things we've seen the president do is whenever there's a storyline that is damaging to him or that he doesn't like, he'll tweet something that is so provocative you cannot not write about it, because the president of the United States is saying something that is extraordinary. But what I think we have tried to learn is that you cannot have that be the only thing that takes your attention. Right. You give it some attention, but you also try to keep your eye on the ball.
Bob, I'm giving you all the ethical journalistic puzzlers tonight, for which I apologize. But in the 2016 race, when the intelligence agencies of the U.S. government said that the information given to WikiLeaks was given to WikiLeaks by the Russian intelligence services, Marco Rubio said, I'm not going to talk about this in the campaign context. He said, because this is the Russians messing with our election. This was happening in real time in the election. And I asked about WikiLeaks, a lot of people in the press asked about WikiLeaks, in the material contained therein and what it did or didn't say about the Clinton campaign, or even just about it in general. Do you think in the same circumstances now in 2020, how would the press react differently to material that was obviously ill-gotten, but that was playing a role in the race? I mean, the nominee of the Republican Party was saying, everybody go look at WikiLeaks. What does the press do?
The Washington Post reported on the WikiLeaks leak because it was news and we did not indulge in it in some kind of tabloid story, but you covered it as a political story. In the last few years, thankfully, news organizations like my own have been able to become more informed about deep fakes, about the way fake news operates, the way foreign actors are interfering on social media. So there's a higher level of knowledge right now in the news media about how to handle these type of difficult stories when you're dealing with information that may be illegally obtained or obtained through foreign actors. But the idea of walking away from it, that you can't walk away from news, but you can do a better job of covering it. Can I just add a quick point on 2016 that I always get told by some voters when I'm out on the campaign trail that President Trump was covered too much in 2016. It's not true. He was maybe aired too much on television in terms of cable TV. He was not covered enough. We started covering him in 2015 at the Washington Post. We put him on the front page. We were laughed at for putting him on the front page because people said he's not serious. It doesn't matter if people are perceived as serious or not. We started covering birtherism. We covered it up until Election Day, his birther history. He demanded more serious coverage of his finances. David Farenthold, who sits next to me at the Post, broke the Access Hollywood story and won a Pulitzer for the Trump Foundation. President Trump demanded more coverage, news coverage, investigative coverage, and he should have been taken more seriously sooner. You can argue about the television coverage, but someone brought up Marianne Williamson, one of you, right? You brought up Marianne Williamson. People laugh at her campaign. They say, oh, she's a little out there. She demands coverage. She's on the debate stage. There's another assumption. Marianne Williamson, oh, she's going to go nowhere. Who says? Who says in this broken system?
3 articles on the end of Kirsten Gillibrand's campaign. I mean, she's been declared dead now by 3 different major news outlets, right? Because she didn't raise the money that they expected. So 3 papers, the Atlantic, the Politico, and the Washington Post all wrote basically postmortems on her campaign, and yet she's in the debate.
We're going to open it up for questions in a second. It looked like you were about to jump in and say something, and then we'll turn it to the audience.
So I have 2 quick points. The first is I remember being on the Bernie bus, in Bernie Sanders' campaign bus, rather, and coming home or coming back to hotels and being dead tired and then turning on CNN just to see what was going on in the world and being stuck watching Donald Trump for like an hour, losing sleep, wondering what in the world is going on TV. I really struggle with the idea of like maybe he shouldn't have been on TV so much because it was something that you really wanted to watch. Like it was like, wait, what is going on? Who is this person? How is he saying this stuff? He's calling in when people couldn't get Hillary Clinton on the phone or she couldn't do press conferences, and Donald Trump is calling MSNBC and other places talking for hours. I think the lesson of the 2016 campaign is also to candidates, if you see someone getting a bunch of attention, you need to make yourself available because Hillary Clinton was hard to get an interview with. She was hard to get hold of a press conference for, and that's part of the issues that I think led to that coverage.
This used to happen at Face the Nation all the time. People would say, why didn't you book X, Y, and Z? Because we called X, Y, and Z, and they don't want to talk because talking out loud is something they don't want to do in front of a camera.
Look at Buttigieg. Why is Buttigieg where he is? Buttigieg did every single press interview, every request, he said yes. And people say, well, how does he come out of nowhere in South Bend? Because in this environment, to Yamisha's point, you have to be ubiquitous to have a presence. That's not fair. It's not right, probably, in a lot of people's views, but that's how it is.
And then the other quick thing I was going to say was about, you were asking about WikiLeaks and how they would be covered. It makes me kind of cringe as a reporter. If WikiLeaks put out every single year of Donald Trump's tax returns, they'd probably get covered. Even if reporters knew that it was obtained illegally, I'm willing to bet that someone out there, doesn't matter what news organization, someone would be writing those stories. They would get picked up, and then maybe we start talking about it on television. I think I'm not convinced that reporters and media organizations will say this information was obtained illegally, we can't cover it. I just don't think it would happen.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't think it would either. It's just the charge is that the organizations become the handmaidens of, the Russians, essentially. All right, let's, here's a question here.
Hi, good evening. My name is Christian. I have a question about your opinion about the role of the Latino vote in the 2020 presidential election. Just coming off of the 2018 midterms, I look at the 7 congressional districts in my state of California and how they were overturned primarily because young Latino voter turnout came out in record numbers. And there are 32 million eligible Latino voters at this next election, the largest ethnic group, but I don't hear anything about it. And I don't hear any of the candidates making the active effort to court the Latino vote. So I'd love to hear any of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been preaching to everybody that will listen to me, that this election is going to turn on the enthusiasm of women, Latino voters, and young people. And that, as it did in many ways for Obama, is going to be the decider. It will not be an election that is won on just anti-Trump. It is going to require mass mobilization, a huge amount of energy from folks who have been historically more on the margins of the voting population, but who showed in 18 that they could show up and be a force. One thing that's really different in this cycle from 16 is that since 16, there have been dozens and dozens of grassroots voter mobilization organizations all over America targeting 1,000 pockets of voters that were not engaged in 16 and working to get them registered. We've had corporations working to get their employees and their customers registered. So I think that they are a huge force and that they will be the factor. The folks who have in the past not been the deciders, their turnout, I think, is going to be everything.
Going to Lauren's point about Doug Jones in Alabama, part of Doug Jones's ability to get black women to vote for him was that he showed a history of being interested in civil rights issues. He had been interested in prosecuting the murderers of the 4 black girls who were killed in that church bombing. If you're a candidate that's just going to show up and start speaking Spanish and say, hey, I'm really interested in you, where are your receipts? Like, what were you doing 4 years ago? I think that's going to be a big question this year.
So I think, we have an office in Albuquerque, and we've been doing a lot of national work to figure out best practice for studying Latino voters, like the questions you ask, the economic issues that folks care about. I think there's this misconception around the country that Latino voters only care about immigration, and that for everybody who's not Latino, they are all against immigration, and that's as simple as it is. And neither of those things are true. There are consensus positions on immigration that Republicans could get on board, certainly could have in a different climate with a different president but beforehand, and hopefully can again, but their voters are open to it. There's certainly a lot of consensus positions, and Latino voters are not a monolith. They have a variety of different issues that they care about, but obviously when you have a president who, treats children at the border in such horrendous conditions, it's hard for that to not be a top issue, not just for Latino voters, but for a lot of voters around the country.
And, by the way, the White House has not given up on Latino voters. They do not assume that every Latino voter that shows up is going to vote for a Democrat, which is one reason you hear the president talk about record low Hispanic unemployment, record low African American employment. On some cultural issues, I think the White House thinks the president has a case to make with Latino voters. So it's as Margie was saying, it's a complicated electorate. And the issue with Latino voters in the past has been often not where they stand, but will they show up? And the one question that you're going to hear a lot of Democratic contenders talk about is who has a message that will make the voters who could make a difference make the difference, but only if they turn out.
Hi, yeah. So one of the main issues I personally found with the media coverage in 2016 was the fact that in this desire to not be accused of being political, what they would do is they would inflate a pseudo-scandal like the Hillary Clinton email situation to make it look like it was almost equivalent to the 100 legitimate scandals that Donald Trump faced. And I feel like you see that same kind of thing happening with the Elizabeth Warren DNA test, all these kind of things. So my question is, do you think the media will approach it any differently in 2020? In this desire to not to seem like they're so fair, to make sure they don't create a false equivalence?
Yeah, I was just talking to someone about this today. I think a lot of people are worried that Donald Trump is going to somehow be the standard, and that if you haven't been accused of raping a woman, or you haven't been accused of calling for the death penalty for 5 wrongfully convicted Black and Latino boys, that you somehow get a pass. So there were so many people who thought Elizabeth Warren's DNA test was a bad thing. It just was not. A lot of people thought it was just rolled out poorly. A lot of people took real offense to Joe Biden talking about the civil war times of Democrats who literally called for the death of Negroes all across the country. To call them segregationists is like a nice way to put it. They were calling for Black people to be murdered and for people that look like me to not be on the earth anymore. So as much as Democrats, I think, are worried about kind of conflating things that might look small to some people, I think there are a lot of people who are also worried that somehow Donald Trump becomes the standard, and it's like, oh well, as long as Joe Biden hasn't raped somebody, he's okay. He can get a pass for whatever he does. I think it's a hard thing to cover, but I think that's what a lot of Democrats are worried about.
Here's a question.
I have a question. So I've heard that the Latino vote or Latinx vote may turn the election, or the black vote or the female vote, if they would only, these women would only learn what they should learn. I'm a white male. Does my vote can have a say in the election, or should I stay home?
If you look at the 2018 elections, Democrats had high expectations for what would happen in Georgia in the gubernatorial race with Stacey Abrams, Andrew Gillum running in Florida, and Beto O'Rourke running in Texas. Those were the races where top Democratic strategists expected if they were able to get a strong Latino turnout, strong African American turnout, they could really start to come back, a little bit of a blue wave in the South, and ahead of 2020 start to eat into President Trump's territory. And one of the takeaways, I'd love to hear the polling perspective on this, is that when I was down there covering 2018, you saw high turnout among those core groups for the Democrats, but you also saw enormous turnout among some of the core white voters for Republicans who were in those states, stoked by President Trump on issues like trade and immigration. So when you ask, as a white man, do you matter in the political calculus? You certainly do. This White House believes its voters, white and others, but majority white in many of these states, need to be electrified, not just motivated, electrified, for him to have a chance at winning the Electoral College again in 2020. And so expect you to be targeted constantly if you're right of center, in particular, on those issues.
So it matters if I'll vote for Trump? What if I don't want to vote for Trump?
Well, if you don't want to, what do you mean? I mean, of course your vote matters.
I mean, there are a lot of closed-door conversations among Democrats about, do we focus on the diversity of our party, or do we need to focus on areas that we lost and rural and exurban white men who feel, left out of the political debate? And the answer is all of the above, that we don't have to choose, that if we have a message, right now we have, there is a message, we have an incredible crisis of leadership and a crisis of our government, and that the number one issue that people say is facing the country is not the economy, but that we have political dysfunction. That transcends party lines. We have this, massive crisis that galvanizes all Democrats, and that includes the diversity of our party, which is finally getting a little bit of the political power that it deserves, as well as folks who've traditionally been in power.
One last question. Oh, I see one. Yes.
Great. I think it was Robert Costa mentioned the institutional, the decline in America's trust in certain institutions. Not on your list was the media, which I think is down there in terms of favorability with the Congress. So my question goes to why that is, and could it perhaps be because there's this breathless, hair-on-fire coverage about things like the Covington boys that was promoting a certain narrative that maybe the media wanted promoted, or, for example, the Jussie Smollett story, which did the same. And does that account perhaps for the fact that the media is among those institutions that's lost favor in the country?
The media's institutional integrity is at a very fragile moment. I would agree with you. I should have included it in my list. I'm not here to speak on behalf of every news organization. All I can say is I believe personally you have to dedicate yourself to nonpartisan coverage because it is so easy to be pulled into conventional wisdom or into news stories that are not fully documented. The rush on social media to make an assumption or to make a conclusion is always out there as a temptation in this business. And I just know at Washington Week and Washington Post, we try to take a pause to digest what's happening and to report. So much of what's happening in the media used to be a pretty partisan organization back in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. It was really only post-Murrow that this idea of a nonpartisan press started to exist. Even the Washington Post, most national newspapers, they were political organs. They were partisan organizations. It was after World War II and that this nonpartisan atmosphere really took hold for the better. And it's not something that's guaranteed. The media in England, very partisan often. That's the history in the UK. We could easily see this nonpartisan veneer and core of the media fall away if it's not protected day in, day out, and move back, revert to this partisanship in the media. And that's why it takes commitment and dedication, and also not being allowed to become political or just to make decisions in a rash way. Being part of a news organization, a lot of you here are corporate leaders, it's like being part of any company. You have to do your due diligence. You have to have leadership. It's not that hard. It's not some kind of crazy equation. It's the basics. Do the basics right.
I would say you mentioned the Covington boys and you mentioned Jussie Smollett. I would also say there's a Central Park Five, where 5 black young and brown boys basically were told in the media, were described in the media as wild animals going after a white woman. I think that for a long time there have been communities in this country that have looked at the media and said they're not representing who I am. For African Americans, seeing mugshot after mugshot on their local TV news stations when they know that that's not who they're raising in their home. For Latinos, for gay people, all sorts of people who are watching the TV saying that's not who we are. I think that trust in the media is now spreading, or that questioning of the trust in the media is now spreading across the country. But I think as a reporter who's covered race for a long time, I've never gone into someone's home thinking this person inherently trusts me. I think that journalists every day should be earning the trust, that every day we should be doing our jobs, doing the due diligence that Bob is talking about. And that's the only way, and to be humble. We have to be humble when you make a mistake and you say, you know what, that wasn't the best way we could do that. Let me tell you how I should have done that. Because I think if we don't do that and we act as though the media somehow cannot have any flaws, then we're doing a disservice to that. But I think that we should all be critically worried if the media is starting to be something that people completely don't trust anymore.
And that's the last word. Thank you to all of you, and thanks to all of you for being here.